It was 1871, and the country was still reeling from the terrible events of the Civil War. In places where soldiers had passed through and left nothing but ashes, whole towns were in ruins, families were split up beyond repair, and the law was often just a faded word. But deep in Kentucky's Cumberland Highlands, a different kind of darkness had grown. It had nothing to do with power or armies. It was the kind of darkness that grows in the dark, away from people, and is fed by fear and being alone. This is not a story about battles, flags, or generals. Instead, it is about a family whose name was almost lost to history until pieces of evidence were found many years later. This is the story of the Barrowfields family, whose farm became a place where many travelers never came back. Back then, the Cumberland Highlands were made up of dark forests, steep ridges, and rivers that wound through valleys like scars. There weren't many roads, just dirt paths. Roads were often impassable after storms, and towns were spread out so far apart that neighbors could live miles apart and still be considered close. In these kinds of situations, trust was often necessary to stay alive. A stranger at your door during a storm could be a friend, a hot meal, or even the difference between life and death. Being friendly wasn't a luxury. It was a tradition. However, as the story of the Barrowfield shows, that very tradition could be used to lead people astray and to their death. In the 1960s, researchers at the University of Kentucky started putting together the pieces of the Barrowfield case. They used scraps of paper, half-burned court ledgers, letters tucked into family Bibles, military correspondence writings written quickly, and artifacts dug up from the ground when a lake was drained to build a dam. Each piece by itself didn't say much about the past, but when put together, they told a story that had been kept secret for almost 100 years, a story of wealth that seemed unexplainable, of disappearances that were not looked into, and of a home that had turned into a slaughterhouse behind closed doors. The crimes and the fact that no one saw them for so long are what make this story interesting. In the Cumberland Highlands in 1871, the government had very little or no power. A lot of county officials had been killed in the war. Police officers had joined militias, and troops, deserters, and refugees were always coming and going. This meant that every missing person was just another name in a list. Too much in the ledger to keep track of. Threats could thrive in this chaos, and the Barrowfield family would leave a legacy that still makes blood chill. Let me take a moment to say something before we go on with their story. Imagine being on those roads, riding through the endless darkness of pine forests, with no idea how far away the next town might be, 2 days at most. It must have been so nice to see a cabin light through the trees and hear a man calling out in a steady voice, offering food and a place to sleep. Now picture this. Agreed, and they never rode out again. Do stories like these make you feel uneasy? If they do, but they also draw you in, I want you to stay with me on the journey ahead. Don't forget to subscribe and let me know where you are listening from tonight if you want more stories like this. This makes me realize how far these forgotten stories can still go. The Barrowfield case is one of the darkest parts of what happened after the Civil War that was kept secret. But before we can understand how it happened, we must first know the world that made it possible for it to happen. A county in Kentucky had its world torn apart, its law and order taken away, and it was left open for something horrible to grow. Kentucky in 1871 was a broken state, weighed down by the weight of its divided loyalties during the war, and the harsh realities of a rural area left to run itself for the most part. Even though the Union said it was in charge, the war wounds were still very fresh and deep. A lot of rural counties had their courts set on fire. Sheriffs had given up, their posts to fight on one side or the other, and neighbors who used to share crops now looked askance at each other. The mountains, which were already far away and self-sufficient, turned into a maze of secret allegiances, deserters' hideouts, and lonely farms where no one knew for sure who they could trust. It wasn't just politics that caused power to fall in the Cumberland Highlands. It meant that when wagons went missing on the trails, there was no one to look into it and no constables to write down the sudden disappearance of a merchant, and the lack of militia to guard the crossings when thieves and raiders came through. People in the area had always supported independence, but now that independence had turned into loneliness, families locked their doors at night. People who were traveling tried to stay together as much as possible, but the roads were still dangerous. People often blamed war, bandits, or bad luck in the wild for things that couldn't be explained. This empty space, where answers and justice were hard to come by, was where the Barrowfield. The farmstead turned into a place of quiet danger. There was an air of mystery about the land itself. Ridges rose up like sharp stone walls. Valleys were full of thick forests that blocked out noise, and rivers cut through the highlands in sharp turns where ambushes could happen at any time. People who lived in those areas had long valued their privacy. They built their farms far apart, didn't talk to strangers much, and lived off of what they could find on their own. Outsiders didn't stay for long. For most people, that culture of distance was just a way of life. It would make a great mask for the Barrowfields. There were rumors of strange families living in these hills even before the war. These families came from other places and kept to themselves. When the fighting was over, those whispers were quickly ignored. People had already lost too much to chase shadows. Still, as more people went missing along the trails that wound near the Red Ash River, the same patterns of silence and suspicion took place. The war had. The Barrowfields knew how to use the space that was made so that predators could move around without being seen. People traveling south often said that the area seemed unusually quiet for being so well kept because their farm was right next to one of the main roads. The war seemed to have taken away not only power, but also the rhythm of life that had kept the highlands alive in the past. The stage was set for what was to come. Neighbors were tired of each other, and strangers had disappeared without a trace. And where the promise of a warm fire and food could save them, or a trap that no one got out of. The Barrowfield family first showed up in county records in 1858. They came from the east and didn't say much about where they were from when they first got to the Cumberland Highlands, but within a few months they bought a piece of land along the Red Ash River that most local farmers would never have been able to afford. The land was ideal because it was where a road going down from the mountains met the valley floor. Traders, travelers, and families looking for a safer place to live after the chaos of war often went there. Even at the time of the purchase, there were doubts, because Nathaniel Barrowfield and his wife Agnes were known as modest people before they left Tennessee. It was still a mystery how they were able to buy almost 200 acres in Kentucky. The homestead they built wasn't like other farms. A 2-story log house with a stone chimney and shuttered windows stood in the middle of it. It was big enough to fit a whole family. It was followed by an 8-horse barn was built, and a smokehouse made of heavy timber and river stone stood apart from the main house. Around the yard, which was kept neat and orderly, there were a number of smaller outbuildings that seemed to be there to impress anyone who saw them. Tax records from the late 1850s put the Barrowfield farm's value well above those of its neighbors. However, there was little evidence that the family helped the local economy. Their names didn't show up very often in market records, and not many people remembered seeing them bring animals or crops to town. The family was very big. Nathaniel, who was 53 years old in the 1870 census, walked with the authority of someone who was used to being in charge. People thought his wife Agnes was in her mid-40s because she wasn't seen in public very often. This made some people wonder about her health. They had 3 sons named Thomas, Elias, and Jonah. They were all strong young men who were quiet, which made people nervous when they tried to talk to them. Two daughters, Miriam and Clara, were even more private and were only seen briefly when their mother was around. Brought them to town to get salt or cloth. In their first few years in Kentucky, the Barrowfields went to church services, but they stopped going soon after for no clear reason. The only thing they said when the minister asked why they weren't there was that they wanted to be alone. The pattern was always the same. They would try to join the community for a short time and then pull away. Neighbors said the family was nice but not close, always paying with good money and silver but not giving much. Themselves back in turn. The farm was doing well, and the fields were well taken care of, but there were none of the usual signs of life in the country. The pastures didn't have any herds moving through them, and there were no sounds of chickens or cattle moving across the yard. It was strange that the farm didn't have any animals, since it looked like it was doing so well. In a place where people paid attention to these kinds of things, the silence was scary. No one pushed too hard, though. People in the Highlands liked their privacy, and the Barrowfields made it possible. They were sure that the people who came up to them had no reason to look any further. Later, when more people went missing and more evidence came to light, the details of their homestead became more sinister. People thought of the Barringtons as just another strange neighbor in those early years. They were wealthier, quieter, and a little too careful about keeping the world at bay. A lot of people who lived near the Red Ash River Road talked about the Barrowfield homestead right away. Tense conversation. From afar, it looked like a place of peace and plenty, with fields that were neatly fenced in and buildings that were well taken care of. On cold nights, smoke rose from the chimney. Still, there was something missing. The Barrowfield place seemed quiet, as if the life of the land had been purposely stifled. Most farms were full of the sounds of animals, children, and work. People who came felt uneasy about the silence in ways they couldn't always explain. In the end, a neighbor named Samuel Turner remembered that. Nathaniel would often be standing by the road and wait for strangers to walk by. He was polite enough to greet them with a nod and a word, but it seemed like he had planned to be there, like he knew exactly when they were going to show up. Turner said he never saw anyone being asked to cross the fence. He paid a fair amount of money when he came to town, Turner said in a later statement, but the man's eyes told you not to stay too long. It didn't feel hostile. Instead, it was watchful and quiet. People who met him were uneasy after hearing his evaluation. Some people saw details that, looking back, seemed more telling. The local storekeeper's wife had only met Agnes Barrowfield twice in almost 10 years. She said she was a strict, thin, and quiet woman who only spoke when she had to. The daughters walked close to her with their heads bowed. They never spoke to anyone other than their family. When the boys were seen, they were big and strong, but they didn't say much. Both sides agreed that there was nothing. They weren't acting in a particularly scary way, but there was a sense that something about them didn't fit in with the normal rhythms of community life. A mail carrier named William Hayes remembered that the farm felt strangely empty when he went by it several times a month on his route. In some spots along his road, farm animals were making noise or kids were yelling before the wagon arrived. At Barrowfield Farm, however, the only sound was the sound of his horse's hooves hitting the dirt path. He took letters to people a few times, usually called from Tennessee or Arkansas, and Nathaniel was always waiting for Hayes by the roadside with a coin in his hand. He never let Hayes ride up to the house. Later, Hayes said that he had the strange feeling that the man had been waiting for him for a long time. Alone, these memories weren't worth much more than being interested in. There was privacy in that land, so no one went any further. People only noticed that the Barrowfields stayed to themselves, and that their wealth seemed to be. They seemed to appear out of nowhere, and their presence made people feel uneasy for a long time after they had passed through their gates. After things happened, these observations would not be seen as strange, but as a warning. At the time, the first people who went missing along the Red Ash River Road seemed to have died in battle. A businessman from Lexington named Jonathan Mercer left home in the spring of 1871 to visit family near Nashville. He was last seen on the path that wound through the highlands of Cumberland. His partner said he wasn't there, but soldiers, deserters, and thieves were always moving through the area. People thought that Mercer had died in the wilderness from theft or bad luck. But later, his things would be found among the things that were strewn around in the ruins of the Barrowfield house. A family traveling north from Tennessee disappeared weeks later with no sign of them. Shirley Howard, Samuel Howard, and their 2 kids, Ruth, 9, and Henry, who was 6 years old, had lost their farm to raiding troops and was staying with family in Louisville. They were seen going through a small settlement near the Red Ash River, according to neighbors, but they never got to where they were going. Years later, Lydia's sister was the one who recognized pieces of children's clothing that were found buried under the Barrowfield farm. Not many people asked questions at the time. People learned to deal with loss during the war. Please explain. Emma Carrolls is one of the most haunting names in the record. She was a 19-year-old schoolteacher whose job ended when her village near the Tennessee border fell apart because of the war. She told her father in a letter from July of that year that she had found a trader to help her get north and that she would be home in a few weeks. When she didn't show up, her family begged for news, but it never came. A locket with her picture on it would be found in a trunk buried in the basement in Barrowfield. For the people who looked at the evidence, this discovery gave the growing list of names a face. By the end of autumn, 14 travelers had been reported missing along a 20-meter stretch of road close to the Barrowfield property. The records were spread out and were often only written down on scraps of county ledgers or in military notes that were scrawled between campaigns. No one was in charge of the investigation, and there was no sheriff to follow their leads. Every missing person was seen as a separate tragedy in a time, full of them. But when looked at together, they showed the start of a pattern that people wouldn't figure out for a long time. The road that went past the Barrowfield farm had become a place where trips ended, and the world beyond the homestead's gates sucked anyone who went there into silence. Later, artifacts were found at the Barrowfield homestead. A worn-out ledger was the most chilling of them all. Its leather cover was worn down and cracked, and the pages were stained and breaking, behind a loose rock in the... At first glance, the book looked like a normal record of farm business. It was the foundation of the smokehouse. But as researchers turned the pages, what they saw wasn't the trade of crops or animals, but a list of people's lives reduced to numbers. People who study history called it the provision ledger. Each entry fit into a pattern. After writing down the date of acquisition in clinical terms, a description was given. Male, about 30 years old. Healthy, gives you 70 pounds of useful stuff. Another line, a female, older, less satisfactory one, but with bones good enough for stock. The writing was neat, deliberate, and free of any hesitation. There was no feeling of rage or passion. There was only a sense of calculation, as if the author were writing about killing pigs or cattle. Some entries' methods got better over time. Young male subjects found that optimal preservation by salt and snowpack worked better than smoking. After 60 days, the November sample is still whole. These words, which were carefully copied into the ledger, showed a mind, or maybe a whole family, that was completely cut off from the people it recorded. Over the course of a year and a half, there were about 40 entries like this in the ledger. Each victim was reduced to weights, sizes, and notes about how to keep them safe. There were no names given, just short physical descriptions. However, Researchers were able to connect a number of the things that were mentioned to personal items that were later found on the property. To read the ledger was to face a kind of evil that was so planned out that it seemed to exist outside the crime that happens all the time. The Barrowfields had not only killed, but they had also made a plan, a process, and a routine. In their eyes, the people they killed were not people, but food. In the early 1960s, Dr. Alan Whiteham of the University of Kentucky was one of the first people to look at the document. In his report, he said that the ledger was an example of the complete opposite of moral order. It was a meticulous account book where human life was recorded with the same level of dispassionate accuracy as livestock. The writing was very cold and exact. Not just one bad person, but a group of them working together. It meant that everyone in the family had taken part, and that the information and tasks had been shared and done again and again. What was even scarier was that pieces of writing showed that more than one person had written entries. Not only cruelty, but also adaptation, were shown by the ledger. The Barrows were trying new things, getting better at what they were doing, and improving how they stored food in order to get through the lean seasons. The battle. The chaos had given them a reason to do what they did. But the ledger showed that this wasn't a last-minute scramble. This method had been tried and tested for a long time before discovery. People who studied it later saw the provision ledger as a horrifying record of lives that had been cut short, kept alive in ink and numbers. Not everyone who went into the Barrowfield property disappeared for good. One man lived to tell his story, and his words were kept in a military file for years. Gives us a rare look at the family, not from hearsay or archaeology, but from their own direct experience. He was a tradesman named Jacob Renshaw, and he was traveling through the Cumberland Highlands by himself in the late summer of 1871. At dusk, he was tired from being on the road and saw the light of a fire through the trees. He also saw a tall person cutting up wood near the yard. Nathaniel Barrowfield hailed him with a steady voice and warned him that the roads were dangerous at night because they were full of deserters and thieves. He gave them food and a place to sleep in the barn. Renshaw agreed, thankful. Beginning, the scene looked like any other. The table was set, and there was a pot of stew cooking on the hearth. Still, little things made him nervous. Clara, the youngest daughter, brought him food but didn't eat herself. The older girl lingered by her mother, eyes down and hands clenched around her apron as if she didn't want to say something. Agnes stayed in the kitchen's shadows and watched, her face pale and serious. The sons sat across from Renshaw. They were big, strong young men who talked quietly to each other. He was not able to hear. Nathaniel asked him about his trip, like where he was going, if anyone was waiting for him, and how long it would be until he got there. The old man's face changed when Renshaw told him that he didn't have a set plan and was traveling by himself. After a while, Renshaw wrote that his eyes got cold in a way that made the fire seem pointless. Oon got worse as the meal went on. It was dark when Renshaw excused himself to check on his horse in the barn. He heard voices in the background. Two of. His heart stopped when the Barrowfield sons spoke in a low voice. One told the other, "Get the hooks ready," and the other replied, "The smokehouse is ready." Renshaw slipped out into the night, leaving his saddle, pack, and horse behind so he wouldn't be caught. His escape was on foot, and he stumbled through the forest until dawn. He walked for almost 2 days before he came across a Union patrol. He said what he thought, but there were so many crises going on that. Because he was so interesting, his story was put away and almost forgotten. Renshaw's account was seen as a very important warning that wasn't taken seriously until decades later, when proof of the provision ledger and the remains that had been dug up came to light. His words made the Barringtons seem like friendly hosts who smiled at their guest across the dinner table while they thought about how to best use him. It wasn't safe to sit by their fireplace. It looked like the start of a trap. The last part of the Barrowfield secret being revealed came about by chance, not because of an investigation or a well-planned chase. It was December 1871, and a sudden snowstorm cut off a Union cavalry patrol from their regiment. They went to the highlands to find safety. Along the Red Ash River Road, they found the Barrowfield homestead. Even though the yard was empty because of the snow, the place looked empty. The chimney still gave off a faint warmth into the winter air. The patrol was led by Lieutenant Samuel Whitaker, who later wrote down that the house looked like the people who lived there had just left hours before. At first, the soldiers were only looking for food and water grain, dried meat, anything that would help them get through the storm. What they found instead was hard to understand, even for men who had been through years of war. In the barn, trunks were found full of clothes of all shapes and sizes, all neatly folded. Some clothes had dates written on small pieces of paper stuck on them. Watches, rings, glasses, and boots were put in groups that looked like they were carefully catalogued by hand. These were not the supplies of a farm that is having a hard time, but the things that many people who died had. As soon as the patrol knew what was in front of them, there was silence. The smokehouse showed more. Inside its stone walls, they saw meat hanging that, when they looked more closely, didn't look like it came from any animal they knew. There were rows of barrels, and each one was full of salty meat that made every man sick to his stomach. The private James McPherson wrote to his brother in a letter that the sight was unbearable for anyone with a good mind. But the worst thing that was found was under the house. Human bones were stacked in rows in the root cellar, where the soldiers found them. Some were sliced open to show the marrow inside, while others were stained from smoke or brine. Hooks and cleavers were hung on the walls, but they weren't thrown around like they would be in a butcher shop. An angry man who had worked in his father's slaughterhouse before said in a whisper that the tools had been kept in perfect order, sharpened and ready to use. The patrol got as much evidence as they could carry, which included the ledger, some personal items, and bone fragments. The soldiers then did what soldiers often did in these situations because they didn't have the power to question the Confederate guerrillas who were still roaming the countryside. They burned down the buildings and moved on. By morning, the Barrowfield homestead was a ruin on fire in the snow, and the family that had lived there before could not be found. The event was forgotten because of the war, and the official report was buried even though it was kept, among a huge number of other horrifying records. But for the men who saw it, the memory didn't go away. They found something that was so much worse than the battlefield that it almost seemed kind. They hadn't seen the sudden cruelty of war, but rather a system of death that had taken root in the middle of Kentucky and was hiding behind the words welcoming and prosperity. That's when the silence ended, and the shadow over the Red Ash River became clear. What people said about that winter, even though patrol was written with restraint, it talked about things that were found that were so gross that even tough soldiers had trouble putting them into words. Inside the Barrowfield property, there wasn't the chaos of a crime that was done quickly. Instead, there was the planned order of a system that had been improved over time. Every building had its own proof, and every corner talked about habits that had become normal. In the smokehouse, the soldiers found bodies hanging from hooks. When they looked more closely, their shapes looked eerily like people. Barrels of salt water. The smell was awful, and when the lids were finally broken open, the men were sick to their stomachs. Some of Sergeant McPherson's soldiers wouldn't eat for days after what they saw, because the memory of it made even the simplest food taste bad to them. A piece of parchment tied to the edge of one barrel had writing on it that looked like the ledger's handwriting. It had dates, numbers, and words like prime and lesser. For them, it proved that the ledger wasn't a lie, but a real record. Keep track of what was done here. It was worse in the cellar. Beneath the main house, the bones were stacked in a way that showed care as well as habit. It looked like the long femurs were arranged in rows, the ribs were bundled together, and the skulls were pushed into the corners. A butcher on the patrol was able to tell that some of them had been cut by skilled hands using well-honed tools because the cuts were so clean. Some bones had been cut down the middle, and the marrow had been scraped clean. Others had a color that looked like smoke, as if. They were kept alive the same way hogs or deer are. In one corner, there was a copper kettle with a dark stain on the inside. There were also iron rings bolted to the wall for chains to hang from. There was a drain in the middle of the floor that led to a hole outside the foundation. Everything pointed to order, not chaos. It looked like a place that was built to be efficient, and the soldiers had a hard time believing what their eyes were telling them. Another piece of evidence was found in the barn. There were trunks, filled with dresses, coats, and clothes for kids, all of which were carefully folded and labeled with a piece of paper. Things like watches, jewelry, and personal items were put in boxes in a way that made it look like the lives they represented had been taken apart and put in order. Later, one soldier said it felt like walking into a market full of dead people, where everything was still there as a reminder of the person who had owned it before. But there was no reverence in the way they were set up. It was just the same cold efficiency that marked the whole. The Barrowfield farm. The effect of all of these discoveries together was huge. For the patrol, the battlefield had already shown them how cruel people can be. But this was a whole different thing. There was no battle going on, no enemy line, and no shots being fired. This was a home or farmstead that had quietly turned into a place where animals were killed in a planned way. Death itself wasn't the scary part. It was the order, the repetition, and the idea that this was how the family had lived. That's it. When the soldiers found the Barrowfield homestead, they had to make a tough choice. They were not detectives or men who knew how to keep evidence safe. Their jobs were to find guerrillas and make it through the harsh winter, not to solve crimes that were impossible to imagine. They got what they could, which included pieces of the ledger, personal items, and some clothes with names or initials on them, and then they got ready to leave. What was left was too scary to look at and too heavy to carry. Linger over. People didn't want to leave the farm, which had a cellar full of bones and a smokehouse full of salted meat. They were lit after Lieutenant Whitaker gave the order. As the snow-covered sky caught on fire, the walls of the two-story house were destroyed. The barn also fell apart, and black smoke rose from the stone smokehouse. The men's clothes stuck to the wind, and their dreams were filled with a smell that was a mix of burning wood and something much worse. Sergeant. McPhersonson wrote in his private letter that he thought he heard cries carried on the wind as the house fell apart. He wasn't sure if the sounds were from memory, his imagination, or the fire itself. At dawn, the Barrowfield homestead was only embers, and the horrible things that happened there were buried under the ash and snow. There was no sign of the family anywhere. There was no sign of them, so it's possible that they ran away at the first sign of trouble or were warned that the patrols were coming. There were no more horses, wagons, or personal bedding taken away. It looked like they had disappeared into the wild. When Whitaker's official report came in weeks later, it barely mentioned the crimes and ended with a simple amen. The subjects have been seen, but no one knows where they are. At this point, it is not possible to go after them any further. It was pretty much over with that, as the case had never really begun. People had to pay attention to other things during the war, and the Barrowfield discovery was lost in the chaos of campaigns and counter-campaigns. Put away. One more horrible thing in a world full of them. The patrol went on, but their job wasn't done yet. What they had seen left scars on their memories, but they couldn't do anything else. The evidence was left to burn in the snow-covered ruins of Cookie's Highlands. Soon, winter storms blew the ashes around. The horrible thing had been found, but it was also buried again because of the war. In the months after the Barrowfield farm was destroyed, the family didn't seem to be seen or heard from through the war fog. No bodies were found, no one was arrested, and no one tried to get justice. Most people thought the story ended in ashes and smoke because Kentucky was filled with battles and retaliations all the way through the last few years of the war. But bits and pieces of rumors started to spread across the South like the echoes of a shadow that wouldn't go away. In 1872, people who lived in northern Arkansas talked about a family named Holland who bought land. The father figure was said to be tall and skinny, The man had a gray beard and an unsettling look in his eyes. He paid with good money, didn't want to talk much, and kept his family away. As soon as they got there, people in cars on nearby roads started to disappear. Someone hired by a farmer to go to Little Rock never showed up, the farmer said. Someone else said that they saw a woman and child going into the woods on their way to a relative's cabin, but they were never seen again. There was no search and no proof was found. After the war, life. South wasn't stable enough for people to pay much attention to lost strangers. In 1873, the same rumors had spread further west to Texas. A report from the sheriff of Bowie County raised concerns about travelers who didn't get to their planned destinations after going through an area along the Sabine River with few people living there. A family had also set up home there, building an oddly large smokehouse and a root cellar that was dug deep into the ground. Rangers looked into it, but when they got there, the homestead was empty. In the cellar, tools with strange designs were found along with barrels that no doctor was willing to look into more closely. The family disappeared, just like they did in Kentucky. They left the site empty, but they left enough of a sense of unease to keep the memory alive. In Louisiana, stories spread about a thin man with sharp eyes and his quiet sons who traveled under a different name and took in travelers on the roads leading to Shreveport. Once more, travelers were reported missing. One more time, no decision was made. Each story seemed like a typical bad luck story from the frontier, where violence and loss were always present. But when looked at together, they made out the faint but steady outline of the Barrowfield's path through the South. No matter where they lived, people disappeared. As suspicions grew, they disappeared, leaving before the evidence could catch up with them. The trail was broken up and spread out over many counties and years. It did, however, point to a pattern that did not end, with the fire by the Red Ash River. There was no damage to the Barrowfields. They had just moved, bringing their darkness with them and weaving it into the fabric of a country that was still shaking from the war. It had been almost 100 years since the Barrowfield case was first brought to light. By that time, the old homestead could no longer be seen because its remains were buried under water when a dam project in the 1950s made a man-made lake. Most people thought the place was gone for good, completely erased from the landscape as. It was as if the earth had eaten the memory. But in the summer of 1964, when there was a drought and the water level was at its lowest, a group of researchers from the University of Kentucky got permission to dig up what was left of the site. Their work would show more than just the remains of a burned-down farm. It would also show proof of the horrible things that were once only whispered about. Working in the ground was hard. The ground was not stable after years of erosion, flooding, and fire. It had grown through the ruins, and the roots of the trees were twisted into the old foundation's stones. Still, the shape of the Barrowfield home slowly took shape. The fire had turned the cellar walls black, but they were still there. Soldiers' reports talked about a drainage system that was found in pieces. This showed that the cellar was built with careful planning. Iron shackles were found in the ground. They were corroded but still easy to identify, along with hooks and blades that were worn down from use but still had the marks of sharpening stones on them. Experts told people nearby that the rusty cleavers and saws were actually tools, similar to those used in slaughterous. The bones were the most scary of all. The pieces found in the cellar and smokehouse area belonged to more than 20 different people. Forensic analysis at the Smithsonian confirmed that they had cut marks that were consistent with skilled and consistent butchery. Some of the bones were burned, and others had stains that made me think they had been preserved in salt water. They weren't just strewn around randomly. They were grouped together as if they had been planned ahead of time. There were buttons, brooches, pieces of glasses, and other small personal items among them, silent reminders of the lives that had been lived inside those walls. In terms of shock, one artifact stood out from the rest. A part book whose pages are bent and almost impossible to read because of water. There were still enough words left to show recipes, ways to store food, and how to make food, but no one would quote them all. It looked like an addition to the ledger, proof that the Barrowfields had not only written down what they had done, but also made them into some grotesque craft. Dr. Alan Whiteham, who was in charge of the dig, wrote that the evidence points to not a series of separate crimes, but a system that had been perfected over time, a domestic operation that had a long-term and deliberate goal. The results proved what people had long thought was just folklore. The Barrowfield farm wasn't like other farms. It had been a place where animals were routinely killed, a house that had been turned into a slaughterhouse. The practices that happened there had stained the foundation of the house, and the family had been erased from history, but the ground finally showed what they had done. The 1960s excavations and archival finds did more than just confirm how scary the Barrowfield homestead really was. They made scholars think about more important issues. How could a whole family take part in such things? That being said, what kind of social or psychological environment must have been in that house for the unthinkable to be normal? Dr. Alan Whiteham said that the Barrowfields represented the exact opposite of frontier morality. A lot of people in the Cumberland Highlands depended on being friendly and trustworthy with neighbors and travelers. For the Barrowfields, being friendly turned into bait, trust turned into a trap, and staying alive turned into hunting. The neat entries and organized language in the provision ledger did not show the crazed thoughts of a single person, but rather the habits of a family who had made them part of their normal daily lives. People helped each other with tasks and routines, and even the youngest members were linked to the crime because handwriting samples from more than one hand matched. 100 years later, psychologists who looked at the case said Nathaniel Barrowfield may have had traits that are now known to doctors as antisocial personality disorder. His presence ruled everything. The thin man waiting by the roadside, the cold look in his eyes, the way he was in charge of his wife and children. But what made the case unique was how his family seemed to have changed, turned into active participants. In other cases of family crime, one or two members resisted or did nothing, but everyone in the Barrowfield seemed to be working together for the same reason. The ledger showed that more than one scribe had written something. The seller's business talked about having many people working together. This wasn't just one patriarch acting on their own. The whole family was acting as a single predator. The question stayed with scholars. Were the sons and daughters forced to stay because they were afraid of their father's power, or had they been free to choose, raised from birth to accept this different set of morals as normal? A scary clue came from a piece of a journal that was thought to have been written by the daughter Miriam. In faded ink, she wrote that she helped prepare the yield as if it were a normal task. She didn't show any signs of disagreement or doubt. She just spoke in a way that made it sound like these actions were just part of daily life on the farm. The Barrowfield case was a unique look at how generations interact with each other in crime. Passing on bad behavior, a moral universe that is so upside down that a whole family could live in it without breaking up. It said that in some situations, like a remote location, no laws, and a strong patriarch in charge, normal social rules could fall apart and be replaced by a cold, utilitarian view of human life. The Barrows had not given up on morality. They made their own, and people were just resources in it. The thought process might have been more upsetting than the physical evidence. It showed that their crimes weren't just desperate acts. They were based on a carefully held worldview that had been formed over years and was a part of the family's very being. The Barrowfield family's story had an effect that didn't end when the ruins of their home and the pieces that were found almost 100 years later were found. It lived on in the culture of the Cumberland Highlands and was a part of people's memories in deep and subtle ways. People in this area had always relied on helping each other and on travelers in need being welcomed. When the truth about what had happened on the banks of the Red Ash River came out, it broke the trust between the people who lived there. Neighbors admitted in letters from the early 1870s that they did not welcome strangers as much as they used to. People started to lock their doors when they didn't know who was coming because they were afraid that behind a polite knock could be bad intentions, just like the Barrowfields. The custom of being friendly, originally a matter of pride, it became tainted with doubt. It wasn't just an act of kindness to let a stranger into your home. It was a choice that was tinged with unease. This worry was absorbed by Highlands folklore, which changed the Barrowfield legacy into stories that could be told again and again at firesides. There were ghost stories. As travelers disappeared into the woods, lights flickered where there was no house, and cries could be heard on the wind near the lake that had grown over the old farm. People who were fishing said they heard voices to see shadows moving along the foundations that are underwater. In these stories, a horror that was really all too real took on a supernatural form. Historians have often talked about how this kind of folklore helps people deal with painful memories. It was easier to tell the story as a ghost story than to face the fact that normal people, a family that didn't look any different, had chosen to use hospitality as a trap and human life as food. The Barrowfields turned into ghosts in stories, not because they weren't real, but because the real world was scarier than any ghost. For many years, the story was a quiet warning. Even as the area became more modern, with highways replacing dirt roads and lakes filling up valleys, there was still a sense of unease. People passing through were sometimes talked about in whispers. Still, parents warned their kids not to go into certain woods at night. Even though the names and details got fuzzy over time, the main idea stayed the same. Trust could be broken, and kindness could. Evil could take on the form of a neighbor and hide danger. The Barrowfields were no longer in history, but their legacy lived on. That spirit lived on in the changed rhythms of community life, in stories that became legends, and in the unsettling knowledge that darkness can wait patiently beneath the surface of civilization for its chance to show itself. As of now, no one knows what happened to the Barrowfields after their house burned down. They were said to be in Arkansas, Texas, and the Louisiana's swamps, which are always known by different names and are full of rumors of travelers who never made it to their destinations. But there is no official record of what happened to them. They might have gone their separate ways and lived quiet lives under fake names. It's possible that they kept doing what they were doing in other hidden parts of the South, leaving only bits of rumors behind. Some people think that they may have been victims of violence and had their lives cut short by a victim who realized too late what kind of person they were. A family is having dinner by the fire. Part of what makes their story last is the uncertainty. People don't remember the Barrowfields as people who were caught and judged. Instead, they remember them as a shadow that faded into history, leaving only pieces of evidence and a feeling of unease behind. The bones, the artifacts, and the ledger all show that what happened was real. Still, the last chapter has not been written. So, their memory lives on not in a clear sense of resolution, but in the haunting sense of absence. The history of the Barrowfields is not only the horrible things they did, but also a reminder of how weak society can be. During a time of war and chaos, when the law wasn't working and communities were breaking up, a family made up its own moral universe, where people's lives were seen as resources and not as valuable. They didn't get angry. They didn't kill quickly. They were careful and patient as they worked, writing down the names of their victims with the same care that a farmer counts his crops. It's not madness that their story shows, but method and that's what makes it so very scary. A reservoir has buried the Red Ash River Valley, making it impossible to see. Tourists walk by without realizing what's hidden in the depths. But people who have studied the case know that under the lake are the charred remains of a smokehouse and the stones of a cellar. These are the only signs of a place where people no longer cared about the limits of what is human. Even though the setting has changed, the story stays with it. A reminder that darkness doesn't need myth or existence of a supernatural force. It only needs chances, being alone, and regular people who are willing to accept a different moral order. After many years, an old person from the Cumberland Highlands said, "Some stories should never be forgotten, even if they make your blood run cold. They teach us to be careful about where we go and who we trust." The story of the Barrowfields is one of those stories. In the end, it's not a ghost story that stays in the Kentucky hills, but the memory of how, in the dark and quiet of a broken world, one family turned dinner into death and hospitality into horror.